Alright, hello Vermont history students, and it is time for the video for Unit 4 of the course, and me and my little friend here are going to make it for you now. And so let's get caught up. It's Wednesday morning when I'm making this. I'll go check your answers to the discussion question for Unit 3 when I'm done. Town meeting was a big success, I thought. Virtually everyone responded and the answers were wonderful, and of course town meeting is supposed to be an illustration of the relative unity of Vermont in an era. It's just on those questions, and so if you are thinking about writing your first assessment paper, just because town meeting turned out not to have a lot of unity doesn't mean that, say if you're writing it between 1775 and 1825 or something like that, doesn't mean that if you look at different evidence, you might decide that Vermont actually became more unified in that era. Whatever the evidence that you use from class notes, from the textbook, and hopefully supplemented by a couple of the academic articles that are in the folder for articles for Part 1 and Part 2, whatever the evidence tells you is fine with me. I'm not looking for any particular answer. I just want you to tell the history of Vermont as a story through your assessment papers. The deadline on assessment papers, well, at the end of the semester, that Friday of the 6th week is a pretty hard deadline. Other than that, I mean, really the principle is space your papers out. Write one soon. You have to write one by a week from this Friday. By next Friday. But I mean, write one this week and then take a week off and then write another and then write one in the last week. You know, write one paper from the 1770s to the 1820s, write another one from the 1850s to the 1890s, write another one from the 1930s to the 1970s, whatever, you know. Just the important thing is don't write all three at the end. Space them out so you can tell the history of Vermont like a story. And so that's assessment papers. Of course, there's a discussion question for Unit 4, which this is the video for that, and it's about the what makes the term Vermonter have value back in that era that we're discussing now, which is the antebellum years. And that question is about what gives the word Vermonter its value. Is it stronger as a concept, as a term? Does it mean more, Vermonter does, when it is defined narrowly or when it's defined broadly? And so I'll be looking for those answers by Friday, and then of course there's another town meeting, which is of course once again due next Monday. Your answers by noon on Monday. And so that should be all of that. But as far as housekeeping goes, if you have any questions or you're confused or anything, please write me and tell me how I can help. Oh, and one more thing is that just so that there was not a danger that there would be any differences between different editions of the textbook, I changed the headings on the unit folders and the outlines to reflect not page numbers, but the names of the chapters or the subheadings to which you are supposed to read. Hopefully that's an improvement, as someone was asking about page numbers, and so I fixed that, and hopefully that's better. Alright, so a little bit of content for you, and I won't go on forever, to say the least. This Unit 4, has 4 sections to it. And the first section is just on a basic level. You have to appreciate that America changed enormously, comprehensively, in the North, and that includes Vermont profoundly, between the 1820s and the 1840s. It underwent what's called capitalist transformation. Many of you might have taken the first half of a history survey and would be acquainted with the concept of the market revolution, capitalist transformation. But basically what England underwent over the course of centuries, the east coast of America underwent over the course of decades, Vermont and upstate New York underwent it like overnight. The Champlain Canal gets built, like the Erie Canal, and it thrusts capitalist imperatives into the countryside, and life changed profoundly. It changed gender roles and race relations and how people built their houses and the number of children they had and their political behavior and the way they worked, obviously. Comprehensively, life changes, and it made people very disoriented. And that results in this era being the era of ultraism, which is to say, people had a huge single-minded, fanatical devotion to some cause. And they would go from one cause to another. It's the era of the Second Great Awakening, of massive religious revivals and religious fervor. Vermont and upstate New York gained the name the burned over district because it's burned over by the fires of revivalism. People form weird communes. They get into Thompsonian botanical medicine and and spiritualism and the anti-Masonic crusade, which we talked about in Unit 3. And so just on a basic level, we have to appreciate that life really changed dramatically. And the question about that is, when Vermont experiences dramatic change that originates outside the state, does that tend to bring the community of Vermonters together or split them apart? I mean, when dramatic change originating outside the state is taking place, is that a really good time for Vermonters to try to reconcile freedom and unity, Vermont's great mission, or is it a really bad time to do it and you just wait till change cools down? You're going to see this again a couple of times. Most notably, I would say, in the 1890s, summer tourism kicks in massively, and that's dramatic change from outside the state that really reorients the state, and we'll get there. And in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the interstate highways are built, and that produces dramatic change from outside the state. And so I just want you to start thinking about when dramatic change originating outside the state reconfigures Vermont. Does that split the imagined community apart, or does it bring it together? So that's unit number, the first section of Unit 4. The second section is on the mid-hill dilemma, and it's really important that you think in terms not just of polar opposites, of the uphillers and the downhillers are completely different from each other, and that's everyone. But it's a spectrum. I mean, everyone's a little bit uphill and everyone's a little bit downhill. I have a chainsaw, and that's about as uphill as I get. But you have to think of it as a spectrum, of course, and there are people who are in the middle. And this section of about the mid-hill dilemma brings you two people. One of them, a senator named Justin Morrill, was a genius at playing the mid-hill position. When uphillers looked at him, they thought of him as being uphill. When downhillers looked at him, they thought of him as being downhill. And he just was politically a powerhouse because of that, unassailable, because he was whatever people wanted him to be. And he played that line beautifully of walking between uphill and downhill and making everyone love him. But on the other hand, I give you a guy whose name was Zadok Thompson, who grew up in an uphill family in a town called Bridgewater. And he went to UVM. He was like the only poor kid in his graduating class in the 1820s. A genius, a really smart guy, ended up as an adjunct professor at UVM. But his big problem was that UVM professors were required to take a temperance oath, to vow that they would not do any drinking. And even though Thompson didn't drink, drinking was popular among the uphill people, and he didn't want to turn his back on his uphill roots. So he refused to take the temperance oath, and so there were limitations on how far up he could go. And so he never fit in downhill Burlington. But once he had left Bridgewater, his uphill family and community, and gone to Burlington for 4 years, they didn't want him back. And so he was trapped between uphill and downhill. He didn't fit in downhill. He didn't fit in uphill. And my question to you is, I mean, should mid-hillers find it easy to walk the line in between uphill and downhill, or should it be really hard? Should it be a really uncomfortable position? And because Vermont is working towards reconciling freedom and unity, and because Vermont is a really strong imagined community, and because the term Vermonter means so much, it's really a big question that sits in the center of this course is the uphill-downhill divide something that exists within people? Everyone's a little trying to reconcile freedom and unity within themselves. Or does the balance that exists in Vermont exist between people? There's uphillers and there's downhillers. And so I want you to sort of grapple with that concept. But just think, should it be easy to be a mid-hiller? Should it be really hard? The fourth section of the course, the third section of the unit, has to do with Catholics. And it's a story about how the uphill-downhill divide evolves and is not always the same. And here's how it works, which is in 2016, I think everyone can agree that you become a Vermonter much faster downhill. In Burlington, it's much easier to become a Vermonter than it is in Belvedere or Wheelock or something like that. But the way that it worked, I believe, in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, in relationship to Catholics, is that it was much easier to become a Vermonter uphill. The state has a significant Irish and French Canadian level of immigration in the 1820s and 30s. And these people now, the ones who went to like Burlington, the population centers, tended to be like a large enough number that they could have their own little community. And they tended to congregate and live together in these little sort of cells, you know, in Burlington. For the Irish, it was down on the waterfront where the Wyndham Hotel is now. It's sort of at the bottom of College and Battery. But in tiny towns where the number of Catholics was small, then they blended in. They married local women and men. They went to the Methodist Church because there was no Catholic church. And they would anglicize their names. Bouchers became Bushies, or they anglicized, like Beauchamps became Fairfields. And there was a Catholic priest, the first Archbishop of the Vermont Diocese, named Jeremiah O'Callahan, who was a real handful. He was a really interesting dude. But he was horrified when he would leave Burlington and go out into the countryside and find out that all these Catholics had now assimilated and intermarried with the local Yankees. He thought it was, you know, a terrible, terrible thing for people not to be Catholic. But the thing was that it's not such a bad thing. In small towns, the Catholics were assimilating. And that, you know, it was easier to become a Vermonter uphill than downhill back then. And so it changes and it evolves, and now it's the opposite, and opposites happen. Back in the 1850s and 60s, as you'll see, downhillers farmed in the most scientific, modern ways, and uphillers farmed traditionally. And in 2016, downhillers farm in small scales organically because it's cool, and uphillers farm, dairy farms, on large scales scientifically, because they have no choice. The number of dairy farms has been plunging in this state since World War II. So in many different ways, over and over, you're going to see that the uphill, downhill, what these people want, it evolves over time. So just appreciate that. The last section of this unit then is on the coming of the Civil War, but it's about railroads. And the railroads had a profound effect on Vermont. What happened is that before railroads there was plank roads, which were very democratic as far as towns go. They would go through lots of towns. And so you take a town like Pomfret, and Pomfret would have South Pomfret and North Pomfret, all those villages would have hotels, and they would have craftsmen, because the plank road went through it. But then what happens is the railroad bypasses lots of towns and just favors a small number of towns where there's depots. And in town after town after small town where the railroad bypassed, the downhillers take off. Generally professionals stayed, but their kids left, because what was there for them in those towns? And craftsmen, the number of craftsmen in small towns like Pomfret that were bypassed by the railroad began to leave, and they went to big towns in Vermont or out to Michigan or whatever, because now people can get around faster and goods can arrive faster, and so you don't need a barrel maker in Pomfret or a harness maker, because you can go over to Northfield and buy your harnesses and barrels that are mass produced there. And so what this is about is that in the when the state's founded, when the uphill downhill division originates, uphillers and downhillers are right in each other's faces. But gradually what's happening is that the downhillers are congregating in fewer and fewer places. They're leaving the small towns, and they're leaving the towns to become uphill. And more of these small towns have an uphill consensus. They're homogeneous. They're all the same old families. And the way that a lot of downhillers interpreted it at the time was that the people with the most ambition and the most talent and the most energy were the ones who were leaving small towns, and the people who were the ne'er-do-wells and lazy were the ones who were left behind. Although the way I think of it, from doing research on it, is that the people who were leaving the small towns were the ones who were superfluous to